Sound check. Okay, so today's kind of the summary day of all we've talked about. Quick review. We've talked about things like chemicals in the environment. Are all chemicals bad? No, there's actually some really good chemicals we need. For example, there's a word that begins with N that describes some of the good chemicals we need to survive. Anyone have any idea what that word is? Nutrients. Nice. Who said that? I heard you say it. Good job, Seabass. Nutrients. You need some nutrients to live. For example, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, carbon, you need those. You even need some things like potassium and calcium once in a while. Right? But there's also too much of a good thing. And sometimes if you have too much of even good chemicals, it can cause problems. Right? And there are even some bad chemicals, like we don't really like leads and bariums and toxic substances in our water supply, right? So we talked about that for a bit. We spent a day talking about how things move, words like active transport, diffusion, dispersion. Hopefully those are words that you recognize a little bit. You probably knew the concept, you just didn't know the vocabulary. And then we spent 2 days, one day talking about water quality and one day talking about air quality, and just some factors, like things like what do we use water for? Or what are some of the bad gases that we pollute? Things like sulfur dioxide, or ozone, or carbon dioxide. Today we're going to summarize this all, and basically that's what my first slide talks about, is you guys probably already knew this, but there are chemicals which enter the environment, and sometimes they move through it. Sometimes it's good, but kind of the whole point of this unit is to talk about when it's bad, like when they are hazardous chemicals, and they enter the food chain. And I've kind of got a picture here to remind us what the heck is a food chain. Remember in our first unit on biology, we would talk about things like the symbiotic relationships, or the parasitic relationships, or predator-prey relationships. Remember some of those vocabulary words? Here's just a basic picture. A water gets soaked up by a plant gets eaten by a bug, but the bug gets eaten by a mouse. The mouse gets eaten by a snake, the snake gets eaten by a hawk. The hawk eventually dies, decomposes, and turns back into a plant, and the circle of life continues. The circle of life. You guys watch The Lion King? Yeah, my daughters like The Lion King. Anyways, okay. Here's the point I want to make. Let's say that something in our water supply gets in there that we don't want, like say PB, which is the chemical symbol for lead. That's a problem. Because if we have lead in our water, then we have lead in our plants. And if we have lead in our plants, we have lead in our bugs and our mice, and eventually it gets into the food chain. We have a name for this. It's on the next slide here. It's called biomagnification. You probably get the concept. You just didn't know the vocabulary for it. Let me try to use the picture to describe how biomagnification works, and then maybe you've heard of this before. Mercury is a really common element that sometimes ends up in our food chains. And we don't want it to be, but it can happen. So imagine that some mercury gets put away in some waste fluid. Someone dumps some stuff in the ocean. They shouldn't, but it happens, right? And a fish eats some mercury. Okay, see how this fish right here has one little dot inside of it? That's not so much. It's not so bad, right? But then this fish right here, well, it ate a whole bunch of these fish right here. So it's got more mercury in it. But then this fish right here, it ate all of these fish and these fish and this fish and this fish, so it's got even more mercury inside of it. And then as a human, well, a human's eaten this fish, and so now humans have even more. And eventually it has accumulated. You guys know the word accumulate? Like it's been built up over time. And eventually we, as like the top of the food chain, we have now accumulated a whole bunch of mercury. Even though over here it was only in little small doses, slowly over time it's accumulated. This is actually really a problem for pregnant women, actually. They actually have to be careful what they eat sometimes, because a fetus or a baby, it's not healthy for it to be exposed to certain things. Obviously, it's an unborn baby, right? And so, like, eating things like tuna is actually a bit of an issue. If you have a little bit of tuna fish, not a problem. Right? But if you were to eat a lot of tuna fish, you might actually accumulate too much mercury in your system, and that can become poisonous or toxic. Okay, so the word is biomagnification. Yeah. Yeah, mercury in general is a dangerous, like in large amounts. Again, we're talking like parts per million in these examples here. Does that make sense? It's not like this fish has like a whole bunch of it in it. I'd agree though, right? Like if you found some liquid mercury that somehow spilled on the desk, we should stay away from it. But like we're talking like these dots right here probably represent a part per million, right? But you add up 1 part per million plus 1 part per million plus 1 part per million, and this fish ate a whole bunch of those, and then you eat a whole bunch of fish. Well, now you don't just have 1 part per million, now you have 50 parts per million, and now it's becoming a problem. So, does everybody get that concept there, that idea of working its way up the food chain? Okay. Here's another thing I want to discuss today. The idea of, well, chemicals can be hazardous when one of the following scenarios occur. When there's a spill, a leak, a contamination, or a meltdown. And I threw some photos on here to kind of illustrate some common problems that, I don't know, we as humans have created. We suck sometimes, if I can be blunt. We spill things, we destroy our environment. This probably wasn't new to you. You knew this already. But let's just use the vocabulary. Here's a good example of an oil spill, if you can see that, right? You can literally see the oil trailing off, in the distance right there. That's probably not a good thing. Here, out of this pipe right here, I have no idea what this, like, orange-looking sludge is, but it's probably also not good. This is a nuclear power plant. And nuclear power plants can sometimes melt down and cause radiation to be leached into places. Anybody ever heard of Chernobyl? It's a Russian power plant that melted down in the 80s? I don't actually know the date. And to this day, like, Chernobyl is still radioactive. Like, you should not go near there. Things don't grow there because of this meltdown. A thing I need you guys to be remembering, I'm not specifically going to be assessing it because I've already done this, but you guys should remember your safety symbols. You guys remember the WHMIS symbols? Things like health effects or oxidizing agent or explosion. Probably the biggest two we're going to talk about are these two, right? Like the poisonous toxic effects one, and this one right here is the causing environmental effects. This is a new WHMIS symbol, this one right here. They only made it just in the new 2015 one. And really the idea is to try to talk about, hey, this might be okay for, say, humans, but it could be a problem to the environment, hence like the dead fish on the side of this like hill, I guess. I don't know what it is. So here's an example of some things that like we don't want to pour down our drains, because they will eventually bioaccumulate and biomagnify inside of our water, and it'll come back up the food chain. So cleaning supplies, hygiene products, paints, automotive fluids. We've already talked about fertilizers and pesticides a little bit. The idea about how a fertilizer is normally a good thing, right? But too much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium can cause algae to grow. What does algae do? Well, it eventually dies. Who eats the algae? Bacteria. What do bacteria consume? Oxygen. And all of a sudden, now your lakes have no oxygen, and now the fish can't live. Right? And so we want to be careful. We don't want to put these in our water supply. So I've got a photo on the next page, not this page. I'm going to go out of order. I got a photo on this page right here that talks about how you should never pour chemicals down the sink or put them in the garbage. Hopefully that was something you already knew, but if not, don't throw batteries in the garbage. Don't pour paint down the sink. Right? Like, this is not good for the environment. Why? Well, it ends up in our sewers or our septic tanks, and inevitably they get into our soil, they get into our water, and now it's coming right back up the food chain. So what do we do with it instead? We take it to this really fancy place called a hazardous waste collection site, also known as the landfill, the dump. Yeah, right? So when you've got things like paints and fertilizers or old microwaves and spare wood and metal and scrap stuff like that, right? We take it to the dump, right? Up on the north side, past Walmart. You guys know where that is? Ever been there with your parents before? It's free on Saturday mornings if you want to drop stuff off. Your dad works there. Oh, cool. Yeah, okay. Right? And so, yeah, maybe I should be asking you questions. You probably know more than I do. Right? But like, this is the place where they can take right? They take paints and batteries there, right? Perfect, yeah. Right. So maybe we should be asking Seabass what they do. Here's what I found online. Usually they either try to recycle them or possibly incinerate them. I'm sure it depends on the dump. What's the official word? We don't call it the dump, right? What do we call it? Landfill? Okay. Same concept though, right? Okay. Here's a slide I skipped here. Two things I need you guys to know. You probably knew this already though. Let's say you're making a new product. You come up with the world's brand new, awesomest hair gel. I don't know. You can't just sell it. It has to go through testing, and it has to receive government approval before it ends up on the market. And one of the reasons why is that we have to make sure that it's safe and healthy, and that someone doesn't all of a sudden discover that this new hair gel that you made burns people's scalps and like causes, I don't know, burns. Right? So I need you guys to know that there's legislation that basically says it's a testing process to make sure that it's safe. And then the other thing I want to talk about here is transportation, and this is going to be a main focal point of the next couple of days, is that when we have dangerous chemicals, we often need to move them, right? I made my brand new hair gel, and it is safe, but maybe it's a little bit dangerous, and I need to then move it from my factory to stores. How do we move things? Well, one of the most common ways is on the roads. Right? Sometimes we use trains. We're also going to talk about shipping things over boat, perhaps, maybe airplane. This picture of a truck like this, I'm sure you've all seen a big chemical truck like this somewhere on the roads before, right? Now, there are rules and regulations regarding transportation of dangerous chemicals. For example, where are these trucks allowed to drive? Where are they not allowed to drive, maybe? Residential streets, right? You shouldn't see a big truck like this driving down, I don't know, like, I live on Grand River Boulevard, right? It shouldn't be in the middle of Riverstone, right? Maybe on University Drive, for sure on the highway, right? But like there's certain roads that are like you even see signs that say like these are the roads for like hazardous good transportation, right? Main highways, right? These things right here, they probably have to go through safety protocols to make sure that there's no leaks or no spills, right? If you're ever taking chemicals, by the way, you should always put them either in your trunk or the bed of a truck. You don't want to have a hazardous chemical like right next to you in the passenger seat, because like let's say that by no fault of your own, you get rear-ended, and all of a sudden a flammable canister of something goes flying. Well, you don't want it exploding next to you in the car, right? We want it in the trunk. We want it further away from you, right? This is common sense, though, isn't it? Right? You probably knew this. Okay, let's do our case study now. Well, one of the tasks that we're going to do is to discuss transportation of dangerous chemicals. And actually, can you just pass these down maybe? What do I need? 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 more. And 3 for you. So we're going to talk about transportation of oil. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can you just pass these to everybody in your group there? So this is one of the tasks, this is one of the tasks that we have to do. We're going to talk a bit today about the second largest oil spill in human history. And I've got some reading we're going to do. It's 2 pages basically, plus a little bit more. I'll do the reading, by the way, so don't freak out that you're going to have to read out loud. I'm not going to put you on the spot here. But I want to talk to you guys about transportation. Because chemicals in the environment, like I've been kind of getting towards, sometimes we as humans, we make mistakes. Sometimes it's intentional. There have been companies who have intentionally dumped toxic chemicals in lakes and rivers just to get rid of it, and that is horrible. They should not do that. But sometimes accidents happen, and they don't intend to spill a whole bunch of stuff, but they do. Right? And today I want to talk about oil. Okay? Do you guys know much about, I don't know, Alberta and oil? Is this something you've heard before? I'm going to give you a bit of a history lesson before we start. I tried drawing this yesterday. I did a pretty poor job. I don't know. Let's see whether I drew a better job drawing it than I did yesterday. Yeah, what did I just draw? Yeah, I tried my very, very best to try to draw South America right here. And this is meant to be North America. I don't know if you can kind of see it a little bit here. Okay, so let me try to describe a few key locations on here, because this was not my best drawing. This was meant to be Hudson's Bay right here, if you guys can kind of picture that. Somewhere in here would be like the Great Lakes. That makes sense. This is Florida down here. This would be California. I did not do a good job of this, obviously. This is South America. Africa would be over here. So that was about Africa. Okay, anyways, let's talk about two locations, actually three locations. Up here, in this top corner here, this is Alaska. And Alaska is known for being very remote. It's hard to get to Alaska. Very few people live there. But one of the things that exists in Alaska is a lot of oil, which is good, because we use oil. Now, I don't want to get into too much of the debate about whether or not we should use oil, like the whole climate change, and maybe we should be environmentalists to keep oil in the ground. We can have that debate later, but for right now, I just want to talk about the fact that there is oil in Alaska, and it needed to get moved. And in the 1980s, the way that they moved oil was by using a big ship that would look like this. It was called an oil tanker. And basically, they would bring the oil from Alaska to California. So basically, they would just take the oil from up here. They would drill it out of the ground. They would have whatever stations they had to drill the oil, put it on a big tanker, and basically boat it. What's the right word to use there? Sail it? No, there's not a sail on it. Ship it. There's a good word to use. Thank you. My brain's not functioning. They would ship it down to California right here. Okay. However, one of the oil tankers hit something. And you guys can probably guess what happened. It caused a massive oil spill. Okay. Later, I want to talk to you guys about another oil spill. It happened over here in the Gulf of Mexico. So the Gulf of Mexico is right in this little section right here. And it includes Florida. It also includes Mississippi and Alabama and Texas. There's a whole bunch of U.S. states right around here, plus the country of Mexico. And the oil place, it was called Deepwater Horizon. And there was actually a movie made about this recently. It had Mark Wahlberg in it. And the story basically is that there was an offshore drilling station, and it caught on fire, and an explosion happened, and oil basically leaked everywhere. And so we're going to talk about these two oil spills. And then the final thing I want to talk about is how this applies to us in Alberta. Imagine that right in about here, I try to draw you the province of Alberta. If you guys don't already know this a little bit, oil is a big part of Alberta's economy, specifically very far north in Alberta. There are two places in Alberta that have a lot of oil nearby. One of them is Fort, I can't write this small, but Fort McMurray. And then the other one is Grand Prairie. You guys ever heard of some of those places? There's a lot of oil there, right? And we like to try to get that oil to other places and sell it, right? Again, I don't want to debate whether or not we should or not, but the fact is that there is oil there that is getting moved. And we want to talk about, well, what's the best way of moving it? So today I want to introduce to you two things that you're going to do over the next few days. One is this case study, which you're going to do by yourself, just an individual thing. And there's a few questions to answer when we're done. And the second one is a research project. And if I have time left over today, we'll go downstairs and research. If not, well, we will have time left over. So anyways, if you guys want to here, follow along. I'm going to read to you guys this case study about the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And it happened in 1989 off the coast of Alaska. It's actually been a long time ago. I was 4. Well, now you know how old I am, I guess. So I was 4 at the time. You guys clearly weren't born. So it's been a while. Let me read here. You guys just follow along. Okay. So introduction. Some chemicals in the environment have immediate short-term effects on organisms. For example, when a herbicide kills a weed. But some have longer-term effects through concentration and accumulation. We now know this word. The biomagnification of mercury. We're now going to have the opportunity to consider a case study of a chemical spill that had both short and long-term consequences. It's the oil spill from the tanker ship Exxon Valdez. In 1989, the Exxon Valdez went aground in Prince William Sound on the southern coast of Alaska. This huge tanker was carrying crude oil from Alaska to a refinery further south on the west coast of the United States. So, again, just to remind you, basically way up north here in Alaska, this is where it ended up crashing into a reef, and its intention was to get down here to California. Let's talk about the oil spill, paragraph 2. Accidents happen. Pause. Sometimes, like I said, we as humans, we do things intentionally that are very bad, like intentionally dumping toxic waste. Companies should not do that. But sometimes they don't mean to. Was this company here, in your estimation, do you feel like they wanted to spill all this oil? Why? Yeah, but why else? Yeah, it cost them billions upon millions of dollars because they just spent all this money drilling the oil out of the ground. They wanted to sell it. They didn't want to spill it, right? So I want to make sure it's abundantly clear. No one had the intention of trying to spill oil here, right? I don't think there is an oil company in the world that's kind of like, yeah, I want to spill the oil. Because the oil is their money. Does that make sense? So I just want to make sure we pointed that out first. Accidents happen. Loaded tanker ships can be accidentally driven onto reefs or rocky shores. Hazardous chemicals can change a beautiful setting. The beautiful setting of Prince William Sound changed when the Exxon Valdez spilled approximately 260,000 barrels of crude oil into the Sound. On March 24, 1989, the Exxon Valdez, which was bound for California, struck a reef, sending 10.8 million gallons of oil into the water over the course of the next few days. Okay, this is important here. The region was quite remote. It's only accessible by boats or aircrafts, and this makes the cleanup efforts difficult. Oil from the spill was found over 2,100 linear kilometers of coastline and over 28,000 square kilometers of ocean. I want to make sure you understand what that means. 2,100 linear kilometers of coastline. Do you guys have a picture in your mind of like how far that is? I mean, as a rough distance, that would be like driving from here to Vancouver, and it still wouldn't even be far enough. Does that make sense? Like, if you're driving 100 kilometers an hour, you would have to drive for 21 hours to go that far, right? So if you've ever taken a trip in a car and it's literally been like a full day's worth of driving, like it would be like driving to here to the BC coast and still keep going. Or it'd be like driving from here to like Ontario. Okay. That is how far the oil spread along the coastline. That is a long, long ways. Does that make sense? The second number, the 28,000 square kilometers of ocean, I don't even know that I can picture how big that is in my mind. I can't even give you a comparison. But like, I guess to do my very best here, if I was trying to picture this out here, I mean, basically this whole coastline, like this, that whole coastline probably from here to here, had oil covered in it. And I mean, if I were to try to draw a picture, I can't even like draw because I put it off the side, but like imagine that like this whole area here was covered in oil. It was massive. Okay, let me keep reading here. Contributing factors. There are a few different reasons for why this incident occurred. First of all, the Exxon Shipping Company did not allow for proper rest of the workers on board the tanker. Fatigue and exhaustion due to excessive workloads, 12 to 14-hour shifts, were cited as reasons for why the vessel was not properly maneuvered around the reef. 2. The radar system was not properly functioning as well, which should have indicated an impending collision. Exxon was found negligent for not keeping their radar up to date, as it had been broken for over a year. In addition, Exxon never finished installing iceberg monitoring systems, and inspections were not performed regularly. Brief side note. The iceberg monitoring system wouldn't have actually solved this problem, I imagine, but like it was just more proof that like Exxon was taking shortcuts on safety. Does that make sense? Finally, the captain was reported to have been drinking that night. However, he was not at the controls of the ship. He was actually asleep in his bunk. But people made a note of that. He was actually drinking that night. Apparently the third mate was actually driving the ship at the time. Okay, let's talk about crude oil. The fourth paragraph here. Crude oil is a mixture of many chemicals. It contains hundreds of different molecules in all shapes and sizes. For example, paraffin wax, which is like what you'd use in a candle, or asphalt, which is what we make our roads out of, they're very large hydrocarbon molecules. Methane is a smaller one. Some molecules in crude oil contain nitrogen or oxygen or sulfur, and metals like mercury and lead can also be present. Crude oil cannot be used as soon as it gets pumped from the ground. It has to first be processed in an oil refinery. There, it gets heated and chemical components are separated as they cool. The composition of oil then changes after it gets spilled. Lighter and smaller molecules disperse into the air or water. Tar balls of heavy hydrocarbon get washed ashore or they sink into the sediment below the water. Bacteria are able to degrade some of this oil for food, however. Okay, page 2. Long-term studies of oil spills, such as the one in Prince William Sound, have increased our knowledge of the impact of oil on the environment. This is crazy. This has been shown that in some hydrocarbons are toxic in concentrations as low as 1 ppb, part per billion. 1 in a billion can still be toxic, and that oil can persist in the environment for more than 10 years. Wow. Okay, impact. Oil from the Exxon Valdez spill covered thousands of square kilometers of water and polluted hundreds of kilometers of shoreline. There was a study done in 1992, so that would have been 3 years later. They estimated that 2% of the oil made it to shore. Most of it evaporated or dispersed into the water. 10 years after the spill, bacteria and light had broken down some of the oil. You guys remember that slide we had in our notes where there was some plastic? That like slowly over time light was actually able to cause it to like degrade? Plastic is actually made out of oil, so that actually makes sense. However, another study done in 2010, which would be 23 years later, concluded there was still 23,000 US gallons of crude oil in the sand and in the soil, breaking down at a rate of less than 4% per year. It's going to take a long time for this oil to finally be naturally broken down due to bacteria and light. Okay, how did this impact plants and animals? Many different types of organisms were affected by this Exxon Valdez oil spill. Floating algae was killed. Invertebrates near the shore could not survive due to decreased oxygen, loss of food, or just the toxic effect of hydrocarbons. Fish, eggs, young fish, they were especially sensitive to toxic chemicals in oil. Pacific herring and pink salmon, I have a typo here. I think it's supposed to say Pacific herring and pink salmon fish died. I don't know why I said fry. Or they were physically deformed. Adult fish could avoid the oil by swimming away, but then they lost their habitat and food resources. Seabirds and mammals were covered with oil. Oily feathers cannot protect birds, and oily fur cannot protect mammals, such as sea otters, from the cold temperatures. It's estimated that 30,000 birds and 5,000 sea otters died because of this oil spill, not to mention an uncounted number of salmon and herring. In 2014, scientists reported that 25 years later, some of the species seem to have recovered. They believe that sea otter levels have finally returned to the pre-spill numbers. So it's pretty bad on the birds and stuff. How did this impact people? The Exxon company was ordered to pay $287 million in damages and $5 billion for punitive damages by a jury in 2008. I want to pause for a second here. This company was sued, obviously, right? Like someone took them to court. There was a class action lawsuit, and they were awarded $287 million in damages. What does that mean? Okay. Hypothetically, let's just take another scenario. Imagine that somebody, I don't know, I want to think of a good example here. Somebody is negligent and they drive their car into your fence, and they break your fence. Who's paying for the fence? Hopefully them, right? Right? They've been taken to court. You need to fix the damage you did. That's the $287 million. Okay. So people whose houses were ruined, whose boats were ruined, people who had to lose their businesses. That's what the $287 million is for. Does that make sense? To try to pay them back for their loss. The punitive damages is basically like a big fine. The idea being the $5 billion is not to pay these people back, but it's to be a punishment to the oil company to say, you can't do this again. Does that make sense? It's meant to be I don't know. Imagine that someone gets into a car accident and they end up having to fix the car that they ruined, right? But they also get a fine because they got a speeding ticket as well, right? Now usually the speeding ticket really isn't that much compared to the other damages, but that's why it was so large, is it was $5 billion to try to deter other companies and be guys, get your act together, take all the proper safety precautions, right? Because from the evidence we have, the Exxon company was not doing a good job of being safe. Is that fair to say? Okay. So that's what the punitive damages are. Now, Exxon appealed the ruling to the United States Supreme Court, and eventually the punitive damages were set to just over $500 million, which is a huge reduction, hey? From $5 billion to $500 million. Exxon argued that they didn't need to pay so much in punitive damages because they had spent an estimated $2 billion cleaning up the spill. So let's talk about the math here. $287 million goes to people whose lives were ruined by the oil spill. Your house got ruined, your boat got ruined, your company where you went fishing, we're going to pay you for your company that we just ruined. Okay? $2 billion was spent cleaning up, and then $500 million was basically the fine. Does that make sense? Because of the spill, United States Congress began to take more action with regards to safety and regulations impacting the environment, including legislation requiring all tankers to be double-hulled. Do you know what that means, double-hulled? Basically, yeah. So that, like, if the first container breaks, you have, like, a second container around it. That's all. So. Oh, yeah, the Exxon Valdez oil spill also affected people who lived in the area. Many were commercial fishermen, and they couldn't afford to fish. People who relied on wildlife for their food had to purchase more expensive groceries from the store. The tourist trade decreased dramatically as campers and kayakers chose not to come to a contaminated area. Obviously, who's going to go kayak in an oil spill? That sounds horrible. Right? So these people, that's who got the $287 million. Okay. We're almost done. Cleanup and restoration in Prince William Sound. A chemical dispersant was applied to the oil slick by helicopters immediately, and a mechanical cleanup began shortly afterwards. However, they were only able to recover 14% of the oil. This was done using skimming systems and containment booms. Do you know what that means? Do you have like a picture in your mind? Do you think of like what a containment system or a boom would be? I mean, it basically would be like, in my mind, here's what I'm thinking. You guys know those like pool noodles that you might play with in like the pool? Right? Imagine that you had a whole bunch of pool noodles and you basically tried to put them around a big oil spill and slowly but surely bring them closer and closer and closer together. That would be a boom, right? And what it's supposed to do is keep the oil from getting past the boom. Does that make sense? And then, using a skimming system, some sort of like net kind of concept, you want to try to get it back out of the water. But like, were they able to get it all out? No, not even close, 14%. Okay, last two paragraphs and I'm done. Sorry, I know it's long, but I think this is worth talking about. So, this is the last page here. Unfortunately, the skimmers weren't available for the first 24 hours. Why weren't they available for the first 24 hours? Any ideas? Yeah, because it's so far away. No one lives in Alaska. Right, okay. It caused the oil to thicken and eventually clog equipment. 10 years after the spill, oil still remains on the beaches. Soon after the oil spill, the sediment near parts of the shoreline was removed and replaced with clean sediment. So they got rid of all the sand that was covered in oil and they put new stuff there. These areas have recovered better than areas where sediment was left in place. Some birds and mammals were washed and kept in captivity for several days before being released, and most of them survived. Oil spills and leaks can happen on land as well as on the ocean. Pipelines can rust and leak. Tanker trucks can spill their loads. Oil wells can blow out. Storage tanks can spill or leak. Since the large spill in Prince William Sound, government regulations have changed and new procedures are put in place to deal more effectively with future spills. In Alberta, companies are required to report spills greater than 2 meters cubed, and companies and governments have emergency response plans in place. Hands-on training for people working with oil and gas should take place yearly, and these training sessions demonstrate effective techniques for controlling and cleaning up spills. Okay, so here's the questions I want you guys to answer. There's only 6. It's going to take a little bit of research to answer a few of them, and some of them are what you think is your opinion. So let me read through the questions. Question 1, based on me reading through this like 2.5-page blurb here, I want you guys to summarize for 4 marks what caused the oil spill and talk about why it was so devastating to people living nearby. So basically, re-summarize what we just talked about. What caused it? Why was it horrible? Okay. Question 2, you need to do some research. Deepwater Horizon was the largest oil spill in history. The one up over Alaska, second largest in history. Until in 2010, Deepwater Horizon exploded in the Gulf of Mexico. And you guys would have been alive during this time, but you probably were little kids. I can remember when this happened. This was like, it was massive. It was also right around the time when Hurricane Katrina had hit Louisiana and New Orleans. And so this area down here in the southern United States, it had been devastated by 2 massive things in back-to-back years. I think Katrina was 2009, I want to say. And this happened in 2010. And so I want you to do some research. Now, rather than me writing it up for you, I want you to answer the exact same questions. Research Deepwater Horizon's oil spill and basically tell me what happened there. Why did it explode and what did it cause? Okay, that's also 4 marks. Then the opinion questions. Opinion question 3. What do you think are the appropriate punitive damages for Exxon Valdez? If you were on the jury, how much would you give them as the fine? And don't just tell me what it would be, tell me why. What do you think is an appropriate number as like a fine, a deterrent to future companies? Right? So I'm not talking about paying other people back. I'm not even talking about them cleaning up the spill. What do you think is appropriate of a fine for a big oil company who causes that much damage? 5 billion? 500 million? Nothing? Do you think it's fair that they just have to clean it up? Should there even be a fine? I don't care, by the way. I just want to know your opinion. Okay. And then 2 marks for what do you think that British Petroleum, the company who spilled the thing in Deepwater Horizon, I think you should take into consideration the concept of negligence. Do you guys know what negligence means? Basically, it means that like if they weren't doing their job, for example, like they chose not to fix the radar, I think that should be considered, right? If it was just a complete accident, but they were doing their very best, right? They did training every year. They double-checked things. They had a double hull. They had a functioning radar, and you still had an oil spill. I don't know. To me, that's different than like your captain is drunk, you didn't fix the radar system, and you worked your crew over. Like, there's a difference there, isn't there? Right? So research and don't just tell me the same answer for both, because maybe someone's not as at fault as the other one. Okay. Okay, number 5. I now want to talk a bit about how this applies to us in Alberta. I already mentioned up here, in Alberta, Grand Prairie and Fort McMurray, we have a lot of oil, and that oil needs to get moved. Now, there are some different ways that we move our oil. One is by truck, just like the picture that I showed you right here. You've seen these on the roads before. What's the problem with moving stuff by truck, though? Traffic, what'd you say? They can't go in residential areas. It's also wildly inefficient, right? Because you're only moving it like 2 truck tankers at a time. It's not very efficient when you want to move a huge amount of oil. This boat is massive. It'll do a better job of carrying oil. But there's a third option. They're called pipelines. Yeah. Trains. Yeah, actually that's another option. Yeah, we also use trains for that as well. And so although we want to try to use that to get the oil out of here, I want you guys to do a little bit of research into some pipelines. Very specifically something called the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I threw this on this assignment this year because it actually happened over the summer. Being in grade 9, I'm sure you guys don't spend a lot of time thinking about politics, but this is big news in Alberta and BC to the point where there was actually a trade war between 2 neighboring provinces. Alberta decided to stop importing BC wine for a little while because of this fight over what's called Trans Mountain Pipeline. Basically, here's the idea. It's supposed to go from Grand Prairie down to Burnaby, British Columbia, over the mountains. And then once it gets to Burnaby, we can now refine the oil in Burnaby and then sell it to people and make some money, right? BC government didn't want to let them do that, and there was a big fight. And eventually the government of Canada bought the pipeline and said, we're going to step in and do this instead. It was actually really controversial. It still is actually to some people, because they bought it for like $8 billion. It was a huge amount. 4 billion? It was in the billions. Here's what I want you guys to do. I want you to do some research about this pipeline going from Alberta to BC, and research and write me a paragraph telling me why it's so controversial. Okay? You will find information on this because it happened very recently, just in the last summer. Okay. Okay, and then the last question, number 6. This is again an opinion question. 3 of these questions are opinion questions, guys. It's not like you have to do a lot of research. What do you think we should do with crude oil for transporting it? I'm not asking you whether or not we should transport it. I'm asking you, assuming we are going to transport it, what do you think is the best option? Should we use pipelines, trucks, trains, oil tankers? What do you think is the best way of doing this safely, assuming that we are going to move oil? Fair enough? Okay, that is one of the projects you guys can work on over the next couple of days. Here's the second. That one's done by yourself, by the way. The second one is a group project, and it is like the PowerPoint presentation on transporting oil. Let me talk to you about what I want you to do here. It's basically elaborating on the same concept. Hopefully you guys can see this well enough. I'll zoom in. Here's your purpose. I want you to make a presentation aimed at informing the public about challenges involved with transporting oil from Alberta to the rest of the world. Okay? We want to transport our oil. It's where a lot of Alberta's economy comes from. It's actually the reason why we don't pay a PST. You guys know that? You know what PST is? If you go to BC, they've got like an extra 7% tax. In Alberta, we only have the 5% GST. Because for years, Alberta's economy has been propped up by oil revenues. And recently, although it's been a little bit lower, there's still been no desire to change that. I want you guys to do some research here. Okay? You can actually double up on your research, by the way, and use the same research for both activities if you want. So here's the first thing I want you to look into. Number one, I want you to look into something called the Canada Oil and Gas Operations Act, which is Canadian legislation from 1985. And basically, for 1 mark, tell me a little bit about what this thing is. It's very similar to our last project. There is legislation. Just find me a paragraph or a sentence about it. Okay. Number 2, I want you guys to research something called the Lac-Mégantic rail disaster in 2013. Let me describe it briefly to you. Oil does get transported, like Cale said, by train. And in Quebec, they were moving oil by train. And an engineer who was driving the train, he needed to stop for the night. He needed to rest and go to sleep. And he parked his train, but it was like kind of on a hill outside of this small little village. The village was called Lac-Mégantic. And the brakes on the train failed. Now, we're not really sure whether he forgot to engage the brakes properly or whether they just broke, but basically the train slid back down the hill. It derailed, it crashed, and it exploded. And this small little town of Lac-Mégantic basically went kaboom. And it was also one of these big disasters that was big in the news. Again, this was 2013, so you guys probably weren't that old at the time. But I want you to do some research into that, because it's probably Canada's biggest disaster along these lines. And it's one example of how transporting things by rail is still a problem, because trains still aren't even perfect. So research that. Then for 1 mark, I want you to give me some information about how Canada currently has some pipelines. There are pipelines in Canada right now that transport oil. I want you to tell me a bit about them. If you were to just Google pipelines in Canada and go to Google Images, you'd find some pictures of all the pipelines we currently have. There's lots. Okay. Then I want you to do some research. This is the main focal point of your research. You probably want to each take one of them if you're working in a group. I want you to research 4 proposed pipelines that are in various stages of production about people who want to try to transport oil. Let me show you basically where they go. Energy East is a proposed pipeline that would take oil from Grand Prairie, and it would try to take it about to here, the Gulf of Mexico. Hey, just drop it on the table, would you? Thank you. And so basically the idea is that we take Canada oil, we transport it east to the Gulf of Mexico. This is in Quebec right here, Quebec. And that's one proposed pipeline. Another proposed pipeline is called Northern Gateway, and it would take oil the shortest distance, basically straight across right here, and it would end up in a place, I think it's called Prince Rupert, British Columbia. Third one is one I've already had your research. It's Trans Mountain, which is the one that went basically down towards Vancouver. And then the last one is really big in the news right now. It's called Keystone XL, and it would take it through the United States down to the Gulf of Mexico. The Keystone XL one's really big in the news because a few days ago, a federal judge in the United States put a halt on it and said they couldn't construct it anymore due to environmental concerns. So those are the 4 proposed pipelines. Some of them are currently being built. Some of them are not. I want you to research them and tell me a bit about them. Okay. 2 more things, then I'll let you guys be done. I want you to tell me a bit about some perspective of Canada's Indigenous peoples towards pipelines. And the reason why this is important is that when we build pipelines across vast territory, it often goes through First Nations reserves. Now, some First Nations reserves are very much in favor of it. In fact, there is one pipeline that is being proposed where the First Nations people actually want to build it all by themselves because they want to try to make some money off of it. And that's their hope. There are other reserves that don't want the pipeline going through their reserves at all. So look into that. Then I want you to look into something called the National Energy Board. It basically is the board in Canada that controls who's in charge of doing stuff. Research that. Give me a list of websites and put it into a presentation. Okay, So I've managed to save you guys about 20 minutes left. Here's the plan then, guys. I have today, tomorrow, and Monday, as well as Wednesday and Thursday set aside. I've got 4 days set aside for you guys to do some of this work. Tuesday, we're going to write a quiz. But don't waste your time, okay? I've got the library book downstairs, like the Learning Commons computers. I think that's the best place to work. That way we're not like into a lab. So if you guys want to, go downstairs to the Learning Commons and you can get started on this. If you have questions, let me know. So thank you for bearing with me. I know that was a lot of me talking.